My stepdaughter picked up my chair at her own wedding rehearsal and moved it from the front row to the very back of the venue, right in front of the caterers still setting up tables. "Real family sits up front," she said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "You can sit back here." I didn't argue. I picked up my purse, walked to the back row, and sat down quietly, because I'd learned, over 8 years, exactly which battles were worth having with Vanessa and which ones weren't. What Vanessa didn't know was that the officiant standing at that altar was about to read something from a card during tomorrow's actual ceremony that would make her wish, more than anything, she'd left my chair exactly where it was. If you've ever been quietly moved to the back of a life you helped build, stay with me. Because tomorrow's ceremony didn't just marry 2 people. It corrected something that had needed correcting for a very long time. My name is Diane, and I married Vanessa's father, Greg, when Vanessa was 10 years old. Greg was a widower. His first wife, Vanessa's mother, had passed away from cancer when Vanessa was 7, and by the time Greg and I met, 3 years later, he was a careful, devoted father, doing his genuine best to raise a grieving daughter largely on his own. I understood, from the very beginning, that stepping into that particular role required patience I couldn't fully appreciate until I was living inside it. I never expected Vanessa to call me Mom. I never tried to replace anyone. I simply tried, every single day for 8 years, to be a steady, reliable presence in a life that had already lost enough steadiness by the time I arrived. It wasn't easy. I want to be honest about that from the start, because I think stories like this one sometimes flatten the genuine difficulty of what a grieving child actually needs, in favor of a simpler narrative about a wicked stepmother or an ungrateful stepdaughter. Vanessa's resistance to me, in those early years, made complete sense. She'd lost her mother. I was, understandably, an unwelcome reminder that her father's life had moved forward in a way hers hadn't been ready for. I gave her space. I showed up to school events without demanding acknowledgement. I learned her favorite meals, her preferred way of being comforted after a bad day, the specific anniversary dates throughout the year that required extra gentleness rather than forced cheerfulness. I did this for years, quietly, without expecting gratitude, because I genuinely loved her father, and because some deep part of me hoped that consistency, over enough time, might eventually soften whatever wall Vanessa had built to protect herself. By the time Vanessa turned 18, that wall hadn't fully come down, but something had shifted. Small moments of warmth, occasional confidences, a slowly building trust that felt, to me, like real progress after years of careful patience. Then Vanessa went away to college, and something changed that I still don't fully understand, even now looking back on it. She came home for her first holiday break, considerably colder than she'd left, and over the following years, that coldness solidified into something closer to open dismissal. I never got a clear explanation for the shift, though I have my theories. New friends who perhaps romanticized the idea of a real family in ways that made me an obstacle to that narrative, an increased closeness with her mother's side of the family, who, understandably, had their own complicated feelings about Greg remarrying, and simply the ordinary process of a young adult reassessing her childhood relationships through a more critical lens. Whatever the cause, by the time Vanessa was in her mid-20s, our relationship had settled into a pattern I'd learned to navigate carefully. Polite at family gatherings, distant beyond that, occasionally sharp in ways that Greg would gently try to smooth over, usually by asking me to simply give her space, or not take it personally. I gave her space. I stopped taking it personally, or at least, I stopped saying so out loud. What I didn't stop doing, through all of it, was showing up. I attended her college graduation, sitting quietly in a section Greg's family had been assigned, clapping as loudly as anyone when her name was called. I helped, financially and logistically, when she needed support during a difficult stretch in her mid-20s, that I won't detail here, out of respect for her privacy. I never once, in 8 years, missed an opportunity to show up for Vanessa, even as the warmth I hoped for in return grew increasingly rare. Vanessa got engaged to a kind, steady young man named Josh about a year before the wedding I'm about to describe, and I want to be honest that I was genuinely happy for her. Happy in the uncomplicated way you're happy for someone you've watched grow up. regardless of how complicated your relationship with them has become. The wedding planning process, over that year, proceeded largely without my involvement, a choice I understood and didn't push against, given the specific dynamics at play. Vanessa's mother's sister, her Aunt Carol, took on much of the traditional mother of the bride role, a substitution that made complete emotional sense to me, and one I supported without complaint, because I understood, deeply, why Vanessa might need that particular presence at her wedding more than she needed mine. What I didn't fully anticipate was the specific way that substitution would eventually manifest at the actual event, not just in Carol's involvement, which I genuinely supported, but in a broader narrative Vanessa seemed to be constructing about who counted as real family for this milestone, a narrative that appeared to quietly exclude me from any meaningful role at all. I found out I'd been seated in the third row of the ceremony, not the front, reserved for what Vanessa's wedding coordinator had described to Greg as immediate family, a category that apparently included her Aunt Carol, her mother's parents, and Josh's family, but not, as it turned out, me. Greg raised this with Vanessa directly, gently, and her response, relayed to me afterward, was simply that she wanted the front row to reflect who'd really raised her, a phrase that landed with a specific, quiet sting I didn't fully process until the rehearsal the following day. The wedding rehearsal took place the evening before the ceremony, at the same outdoor venue where the actual wedding would occur the following afternoon, a converted vineyard property with rows of white folding chairs already set up for the next day's event, caterers and event staff moving briskly around the grounds finalizing last-minute details. I arrived a few minutes early, greeted Greg, and found my assigned seat in the third row, exactly where I'd been told to expect it. I sat down without complaint, genuinely trying to focus on the positive. My stepdaughter, whom I'd helped raise for 8 years, was getting married, and whatever seating arrangement reflected her complicated feelings about our relationship, I told myself, mattered considerably less than simply being present for this milestone in her life. Vanessa arrived about 15 minutes later, in the specific, slightly harried energy of a bride managing the final details before her wedding. She walked the aisle briefly with the wedding coordinator, discussing timing, and then, walking back toward the seating area, she stopped directly at my chair. "Diane, can you actually move back a bit?" she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I want the front rows to be like actual family. My aunt's people, mom's parents, Josh's family. I think you'd probably be more comfortable further back anyway." I felt the specific, familiar sting of this kind of comment. Not shocking, exactly, given the pattern of the previous decade, but still capable of landing with real weight in the moment. Before I could fully respond, Vanessa had already picked up the folding chair herself, lifting it with a brisk, business-like efficiency, and carried it to the very back row of the entire ceremony space, positioning it near the edge of the seating area, close enough to the catering tent that I could hear staff members setting up chafing dishes throughout the remainder of the rehearsal. "Real family sits up front," she said, setting the chair down with a small, definitive thud. "You can sit back here." I want to describe what I felt in that moment, and more importantly, what I chose to do about it, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened the following day. I felt genuinely hurt. 8 years of showing up, of quiet patience, of financial and emotional support given without expectation of anything in return, distilled into a single sentence that positioned me, definitively, outside the category of real family, at the most significant milestone of Vanessa's adult life so far. But I also felt something else, underneath the hurt, that I want to be honest about. A kind of tired, settled clarity. I had spent 8 years hoping that consistency alone would eventually earn Vanessa's genuine warmth, and somewhere in that hope, I think I'd quietly accepted more dismissal than I probably should have, believing that patience was the same thing as the right response, regardless of how long the pattern continued. I picked up my purse without argument, walked to the back row, and sat down. Greg, witnessing this exchange, started to say something to Vanessa, his expression tightening with the specific frustration of a father caught between 2 people he loved. I caught his eye and gave a small shake of my head. Not now, not here, not the night before her wedding. Whatever needed to be addressed about this pattern could wait for a calmer moment. What I didn't know, sitting in that back row through the remainder of the rehearsal, was that Greg had, in fact, already addressed something important. Not to Vanessa directly, but to the officiant, weeks earlier, in a conversation I wouldn't learn the full contents of until the following day. I need to explain something here that I only learned after the wedding itself, because it matters enormously to how the following day unfolded. Greg, it turned out, had spoken privately with the wedding's officiant, a family friend named Pastor Aaron, who had known Vanessa since childhood and had genuinely watched, over the years, the entirety of my relationship with her unfold, including its difficult stretches and its quieter, less visible moments of genuine care. Greg had asked Pastor Aaron, weeks before the wedding, whether he might include a brief acknowledgement during the ceremony, not a grand, disruptive gesture, but a simple, honest mention of the people who had helped raise Vanessa into the woman getting married that day. Pastor Aaron, who had witnessed my involvement in Vanessa's life directly over the years, school events, difficult holidays, the quiet consistency that Vanessa herself might not have fully registered from her particular vantage point, had agreed readily, genuinely moved by the request. Greg hadn't told me about this conversation beforehand. He later explained that he wanted it to feel genuine rather than staged, a natural acknowledgement from someone who'd actually witnessed the reality of the past 8 years, rather than something that might read as a defensive response to Vanessa's specific comments. He also, I think, hadn't fully anticipated the rehearsal incident with the chair, which made the timing of what followed feel considerably more pointed than either of them had originally planned. The wedding itself took place the following afternoon, under clear skies, at the same vineyard venue, the folding chairs now filled with roughly 150 guests, the front rows occupied by the specific configuration of real family Vanessa had designated the evening before. I sat in the third row this time. Greg had quietly moved my seat back to its originally assigned position that morning, before other guests arrived, a small correction I appreciated, without commenting on. I watched Vanessa walk down the aisle on her father's arm, genuinely beautiful, genuinely radiant in the way brides often are, and despite everything from the rehearsal the night before, I felt real, uncomplicated happiness watching her reach that altar. The ceremony proceeded through its traditional structure, the processional, the readings, the exchange of vows between Vanessa and Josh, each of them clearly moved, clearly present in the specific way people are during a wedding, that genuinely reflects real love. I watched, I clapped at the appropriate moments. I felt the particular bittersweetness of watching a young woman I'd helped raise commit herself to a new chapter of life that, I understood by that point, likely wouldn't include much space for me going forward. It was during the portion of the ceremony traditionally reserved for acknowledging family, a segment Pastor Aaron had structured, unbeknownst to me, specifically to include the moment Greg had requested weeks earlier, that everything shifted. Pastor Aaron, standing at the altar beside Vanessa and Josh, paused the ceremony's traditional flow and addressed the gathered guests directly. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the people who helped build the woman standing before us today. Vanessa lost her mother, Susan, when she was just 7 years old, a loss this family has carried with grace and love ever since, and Susan's memory is honored here today, in this ceremony, in ways both visible and quiet." I watched Vanessa's eyes fill with tears at this mention, entirely genuine, entirely appropriate. "But I also want to acknowledge someone else," Pastor Aaron continued, and I felt my entire body go still, uncertain what was coming. Diane has been part of Vanessa's life for the past 8 years, not to replace what was lost, but to help carry Vanessa forward through it. I've personally witnessed Diane's presence at school events, at difficult anniversaries, through Vanessa's college years and beyond. Real family, as I understand it, isn't only defined by blood or by who raised you from birth. It's defined by who shows up, consistently, year after year, whether or not that effort is always fully recognized in the moment. "Diane, would you please stand? I want to describe what happened next as carefully as I can, because it's the moment this entire story pivots around." I stood, genuinely stunned, uncertain how to respond to this entirely unexpected acknowledgement in front of 150 guests. I glanced toward Greg, whose eyes were wet, clearly moved by finally seeing this moment unfold the way he'd hoped it would. And I looked at Vanessa. I watched her expression move through a rapid, visible sequence. Surprise first, then something that looked, unmistakably, like the specific shame of realizing, in front of every guest at her own wedding, that the real family comment from the night before had just been publicly, gently, but unmistakably corrected by a man she deeply respected, standing at her own altar, on her own wedding day. The applause that followed Pastor Aaron's words was warm, genuine, several guests turning to look at me with expressions of real recognition rather than the polite indifference I'd grown accustomed to at family events over the years. Vanessa didn't say anything in that moment. The ceremony continued, as ceremonies do, moving forward into its next segment. But I watched her, throughout the remainder of the service, glancing toward me periodically, with an expression I hadn't seen from her in years, something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine, uncomfortable reflection. The reception that evening unfolded differently than I'd anticipated, given everything that had happened at the rehearsal the night before. Several guests approached me throughout the evening, warmly, having clearly registered Pastor Aaron's acknowledgement during the ceremony. Josh's mother, in particular, took my hand warmly and told me she'd heard wonderful things about my role in Vanessa's life, a comment that would have felt considerably more awkward without the context Pastor Aaron had provided that afternoon. It was near the end of the evening, during the natural lull as guests began departing, that Vanessa approached me directly, the first genuinely private conversation we'd had in longer than I could easily remember. "I need to say something," she said, and I could see this was costing her something, the specific discomfort of a young woman working up to an admission she clearly hadn't planned to make. What I said at the rehearsal, moving your chair, the whole real family thing. I've been thinking about it all day, especially after what Pastor Aaron said. I think I've spent years telling myself a story where you were just there but not really part of things, and today kind of forced me to actually look at whether that story was true. "And?" I asked, gently, genuinely uncertain what she was working toward. "And I don't think it was true," she said, her voice unsteady. "I think it was easier to keep some distance from you, because getting close felt like it meant I was betraying Mom's memory somehow. But you showed up for 8 years anyway, even when I made that really hard for you. I'm sorry about the chair. I'm sorry about a lot more than the chair, honestly. I want to be honest that this single conversation, however meaningful, didn't instantly repair 8 years of complicated distance. Real relationships don't work that cleanly, and I've learned not to expect a single moment of vulnerability to undo years of established patterns overnight. But something did genuinely shift. In the months following that wedding, Vanessa began reaching out more consistently, small gestures at first, a text on my birthday that felt more genuine than the perfunctory messages of previous years, an invitation to a casual dinner a few months later that wasn't tied to any family obligation or milestone, just an actual, uncomplicated desire to spend time together. We're not where I once hoped we might eventually be, back in those early years when I was first learning how to be a careful, patient presence in a grieving child's life. But we're somewhere considerably warmer than the back row Vanessa had assigned me the night before her wedding, and I've come to believe that this slower, more honest progress matters more than the version of closeness I once imagined might arrive through sheer patience alone. I think about that rehearsal moment often. The chair moved to the back, the specific phrase, "real family sits up front," and I think about how close I came to simply absorbing that moment silently, the way I'd absorbed so many similar moments over the previous decade, without ever quite naming what it cost me. What I've come to understand in the time since is that showing up consistently, for years, doesn't automatically translate into being seen the way you deserve to be seen. Sometimes the people you've quietly supported need an outside perspective, someone with no personal investment in the story they've been telling themselves, before they're able to actually recognize what's been true the entire time. I didn't orchestrate what Pastor Aaron said that day. I didn't even know it was coming, but I'm deeply grateful that Greg thought to ask, and that Pastor Aaron was willing to say, plainly, in front of everyone who mattered, a truth I'd spent 8 years too patient, or perhaps too afraid, to insist on myself. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been quietly moved to the back of a life you helped build, I want you to remember something. Consistency and love don't need a title to be real, but you're also allowed to hope, and even to gently insist, that the people you've shown up for eventually see the truth of what you've given them. Sometimes it takes someone else saying it out loud, and sometimes that's exactly enough. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, has anyone ever finally recognized what you'd been quietly giving all along? I read every single comment, and next week, I've got another story I think a lot of you are going to need.